June 8, 1849. A wooden marker goes into the prairie soil near what will one day become Fairbury, Nebraska. The man beneath it is George Winslow. He was alive yesterday morning. He complained of stomach cramps around noon. By sunset, his body was expelling fluid faster than his companions could replace it. His skin turned blue-gray. His eyes sank into his skull. 12 hours after the first symptom, he was dead. His wagon train buried him beside the trail, carved his name and the date into a plank, and rolled west before dawn. They had 800 miles still to go, and they could not afford to linger where death had visited. The earth along the Platte River corridor is studded with graves like Winslow's, though most bear no name at all. Some were intentionally disguised. The wagon wheels rolled over them to erase the evidence, because the living feared that other travelers or scavengers would disturb the bodies. Others were simply unmarked because there was no time, no carpenter in the company, or because the victim was a stranger who died among people who barely knew his name. By the summer of 1849, cholera was moving west along the overland trails at the speed of a wagon train, roughly 15 miles per day when conditions were good. It killed with a swiftness that terrified everyone who witnessed it. A man could wake healthy, sicken by midday, and be in the ground before the evening cook fires were lit. The popular imagination of the American West is a landscape of gunfights and ambushes, of outlaws and cavalry charges, of violence dispensed by bullet and blade. The body count in dime novels and Hollywood westerns runs into the thousands. But the actual records tell a different story. Disease, not violence, was the great killer of the westward migration. And among the diseases that haunted the trails, cholera stood alone in its speed, its virulence, and its capacity to turn a routine river crossing or a night's camp into a mass grave. This is the hidden arithmetic of expansion. In 1849, approximately 30,000 people set out on the overland trails toward California and Oregon. In 1850, that number nearly doubled to around 55,000. They traveled in long, slow caravans, funneled through a handful of jumping-off towns along the Missouri River, then strung out along the same narrow corridors of grass and water for 2,000 miles. They drank from the same streams, camped at the same springs, buried their dead in the same soft bottomland. And in doing so, they created the perfect conditions for an epidemic that had no cure, no treatment, and no mercy. The thesis of this episode is simple and stark. Water killed more emigrants on the overland trails than bullets ever did. Cholera, transmitted through fecal contamination of drinking water and food, was the leading cause of death on the trails between 1849 and 1855. The violence that defines the Wild West in myth accounted for a tiny fraction of the mortality. The real killer was invisible, bacterial, and carried in every canteen and cookpot that touched a contaminated stream. The emigrants did not understand this. They had theories about miasmas and bad air, about moral weakness and divine punishment, but they did not know that the water itself was lethal, and so they kept drinking, kept camping at the same springs, kept burying their dead beside the water, and kept moving west. The stakes of this story extend beyond the body count. The cholera outbreaks of the late 1840s and early 1850s shaped the demography of the American West, determined which families completed the journey and which were shattered along the way, and left a legacy of hastily marked graves that stretched from Missouri to Oregon. The disease also revealed the limits of mid-19th century medical knowledge and the brutal efficiency of a pathogen that could kill faster than a wagon train could outrun it. Understanding what happened on the Platte River in the summer of 1849 requires setting aside the mythology of the frontier and confronting the documentary evidence, the diaries, the grave markers, the letters written from Fort Laramie, the cholera mortality that appears again and again in the primary sources as the single greatest threat to life on the trail. This episode will reconstruct the cholera epidemic on the overland trails using the best available evidence. We will establish the timeline, the transmission mechanism, the mortality patterns, and the human cost. We will name the places where the outbreaks were most severe and identify the reasons why the disease struck hardest in certain segments of the route. We will examine the response of the emigrants, the futility of their remedies, and the long-term consequences of an epidemic that killed hundreds, possibly thousands, in the space of a few migration seasons. The evidence is fragmentary, the death toll is uncertain, but the central fact is not in dispute. Cholera, not violence, was the defining hazard of the westward trails during the gold rush years. The Oregon Trail, the California Trail, and the Mormon Trail were not distinct routes but overlapping corridors that shared much of the same ground between the Missouri River and the Rocky Mountains. All three began at jumping-off towns on the western edge of American settlement: Independence, St. Joseph, Council Bluffs, and others. From there, the trails followed the Platte River west across Nebraska, then the North Platte into present-day Wyoming, converging near Fort Laramie before diverging again toward different destinations. The combined traffic on these routes surged dramatically in the late 1840s. Before 1848, emigration to Oregon and California was modest, measured in hundreds or low thousands per year. The discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in January 1848 changed everything. By the spring of 1849, tens of thousands of Americans were gathering in the Missouri River towns, outfitting wagons, purchasing livestock, and preparing for a 2,000-mile journey that would take 4 to 6 months. The numbers are imprecise, but the best estimates place the total emigrant traffic in 1849 at around 30,000 people. In 1850, the total rose to approximately 55,000. In 1852, traffic across the Wyoming segment of the trail may have reached 70,000, as the combined flows of the Oregon, California, and Mormon routes peaked in the same narrow corridor. These numbers represented an unprecedented concentration of human beings moving through a landscape that had never supported such density. The trails were not roads, they were ruts, worn into the prairie by thousands of wagons following the same paths to the same water sources. Wagon trains could not spread out indefinitely. They needed grass for livestock, water for people and animals, and timber for cooking and repairs. This forced them into a limited number of campsites, which were used over and over by successive companies. A popular spring or river crossing might host dozens of wagons in a single night, then dozens more the next night and the next, for weeks on end during the migration season. The Missouri River jumping-off towns were the first bottlenecks. Independence, St. Joseph, and Council Bluffs were crowded, chaotic, and filthy by the spring of 1849. Thousands of emigrants waited for the grass to green up on the prairie before starting west, and while they waited, they camped in close quarters, shared water sources, and traded goods and information. Cholera was already endemic in the Mississippi and Missouri River valleys by the late 1840s. The disease had arrived in North America via ships from Europe and had spread along the river systems, flaring up in cities and towns during the warm months. The emigrants carried it with them when they left the Missouri. Cholera is caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae, which spreads through the fecal-oral route. Contaminated water and food are the primary vectors. The disease produces violent diarrhea and vomiting, which rapidly dehydrate the victim. In severe cases, death can occur within hours. The emigrants did not understand this mechanism. Germ theory would not be widely accepted for another generation. In 1849, most Americans believed that disease was caused by miasmas, foul air rising from swamps or decaying matter, or by imbalances in the body's humors. Some believed cholera was a divine punishment for sin. None of these theories led to effective prevention or treatment. The standard remedies of the time included bloodletting, purgatives, and opiates. All of them were useless or actively harmful. Bloodletting weakened patients who were already losing fluids. Purgatives worsened the diarrhea. Opiates might ease the pain but did nothing to address the dehydration that killed. The one intervention that might have saved lives, rehydration with clean water and electrolytes, was not understood or practiced. Victims were often denied water because their companions believed that drinking would worsen the diarrhea. In reality, the lack of fluids guaranteed death. The speed of cholera mortality terrified the emigrants. A person could wake feeling fine, develop symptoms by mid-morning, and be dead by evening. Some victims lasted only a few hours from first symptom to death. The disease produced distinctive physical signs. The skin turned cold and clammy, then took on a bluish or grayish cast. The eyes sank. The voice became faint and hoarse. The body expelled massive quantities of fluid. Witnesses described the victims as looking like corpses before they were actually dead. The rapidity and the visible horror of the disease created panic in the wagon trains. Companies sometimes abandoned the sick, leaving them beside the trail with a few supplies and a hope that another train would stop to help. In many cases, no one stopped. The geography of the cholera outbreaks followed the geography of the trail. The worst mortality occurred between the Missouri River jumping-off towns and Fort Laramie, a distance of roughly 650 miles. This segment of the trail ran along the Platte and North Platte Rivers, through what is now Nebraska and eastern Wyoming. The route was relatively easy in terms of terrain, flat or gently rolling, with few major obstacles. But it was also the segment where wagon traffic was most concentrated, where campsites were used most heavily, and where the water sources were most easily contaminated. Fort Laramie was a critical landmark on the trail, a trading post and military installation where emigrants could rest, repair equipment, and send letters back to the States. It sat near the confluence of the Laramie and North Platte Rivers, about 650 miles from the Missouri and roughly halfway to the gold fields of California. By the time wagon trains reached Fort Laramie, they had been on the trail for 4 to 6 weeks. If cholera was going to strike, it usually struck before Laramie. Contemporary accounts consistently report that cholera cases declined sharply west of the fort. The reasons for this pattern are not fully understood, but likely relate to changes in hydrology and the faster-flowing, less contaminated streams of the higher elevations. The emigrants who survived the journey kept diaries and wrote letters. These documents, preserved in archives and libraries, provide the most direct evidence of the cholera epidemic. They describe the graves beside the trail, the speed of the deaths, the terror and helplessness of the survivors. They also provide specific dates, locations, and victim counts that allow historians to reconstruct the epidemic's progress. The diaries are not comprehensive. Most emigrants did not keep detailed records, and many of the records that were kept have been lost. But enough survived to establish the basic facts. Cholera was present on the trail in 1849, it was widespread and deadly in 1850, and it continued to appear sporadically through the mid-1850s. The emigrants were ordinary people undertaking an extraordinary journey. They were farmers, merchants, laborers, and professionals. They traveled in family groups, neighborhood companies, and ad hoc associations formed in the jumping-off towns. The wagon trains varied in size from a handful of wagons to several dozen, though the largest trains often broke up after a few weeks on the trail due to disputes over pace, leadership, or resources. Each wagon required a team of draft animals, usually oxen or mules, and carried several thousand pounds of supplies: flour, bacon, beans, coffee, tools, spare parts, clothing, and personal belongings. The emigrants walked most of the way. Riding in the wagons was reserved for the sick, the elderly, and small children. The daily routine on the trail was monotonous and exhausting. The train started before dawn, traveled until midday, rested during the heat, then continued until late afternoon or evening. At night, the wagons were arranged in a circle or a line, and the livestock were turned out to graze under guard. Meals were simple: bacon, bread or biscuit, beans, coffee. Water came from whatever stream or spring was nearby. If the water was muddy or alkaline, the emigrants sometimes strained it through cloth or let it settle before drinking, but they had no way to purify it. Boiling would have killed the cholera bacteria, but boiling every drop of drinking water was impractical and not understood to be necessary. The companies that traveled together on the trail were bound by informal agreements and elected leaders. These arrangements were fragile and often broke down under stress. When cholera struck, the social fabric of the wagon train could disintegrate. Healthy members might refuse to care for the sick, fearing contagion. Families with sick members might be shunned or left behind. Graves were dug hastily, services were brief or non-existent, and the trains moved on. The overriding imperative was to keep moving, to make the miles, to reach the destination before winter closed the mountain passes. Compassion competed with survival, and survival usually won. The Fort Laramie post provided a point of contact with the outside world. Emigrants could send letters east via military couriers or westbound travelers. Some of these letters survive and offer contemporary testimony to the cholera epidemic. One letter, written by A.C. Sponsler in 1850 from Fort Laramie, states that cholera killed hundreds along the plains that year and notes that the disease was rare west of the fort. This observation matches the pattern reported in other sources. Heavy mortality on the Platte and North Platte, declining incidence west of Laramie. The spring of 1849 was the beginning. The emigrant season started in April or May, when the prairie grass was tall enough to feed the livestock. The first wagon trains out of Independence and St. Joseph that year carried cholera with them, the kati. Disease appeared in the jumping-off towns, then moved west with the trains. By late May and June, graves were appearing along the Platte. The diaries and letters from that year describe dozens of deaths. George Winslow's grave near Fairbury, marked with his name and the date June 8, 1849, is one of the few that can still be identified. Most of the others are lost, plowed under by farmers, or eroded by wind and rain. The scale of the 1849 outbreak is difficult to quantify. Estimates of trail deaths for any given year are imprecise because many graves were not marked and because the emigrants kept inconsistent records. Some diarists noted every grave they passed. Others mentioned only deaths in their own company. The total emigrant population in 1849 was approximately 30,000. If 1 in 10 died, as some contemporary estimates suggest, that would be 3,000 dead. If the true rate was 1 in 20, it would be 1,500. If disease accounted for the majority of deaths, as all sources agree, and if cholera was the leading disease, as the evidence strongly indicates, then cholera likely killed several hundred emigrants in 1849, possibly more than 1,000. The 1850 season was worse. Emigrant traffic nearly doubled to around 55,000 people. The cholera outbreaks were more widespread and more deadly. Diaries from that year describe the trail as lined with graves. One emigrant counted 80 graves in a single day's travel. Another wrote that the smell of death hung over the campsites. The timing and location of the outbreaks followed the same pattern as 1849. Heavy mortality between the Missouri and Fort Laramie, declining incidence to the west. The disease moved with the wagon trains, recontaminating the same water sources that had been used the previous year. The mechanism of transmission was straightforward, though not understood at the time. A cholera victim's diarrhea contained billions of Vibrio cholera bacteria. If the victim was camped beside a stream and used the stream for waste disposal, the bacteria entered the water. If downstream companies drank from that stream, they ingested the bacteria and became infected. If those new victims camped at the next popular water source and repeated the process, the epidemic leapfrogged west along the trail. The cycle was self-perpetuating and required only ignorance, proximity, and the rhythms of wagon train travel to sustain it. Certain locations on the trail became notorious for cholera. Willow Spring, a campsite in present-day Wyoming, was associated with multiple outbreaks. Reports from 1851 document cholera cases there, and the location remained a concern in subsequent years. The reason some sites were more dangerous than others likely relates to water quality, traffic volume, and local sanitation practices. Springs that produced limited water could become heavily contaminated if dozens of wagons camped there in succession. River crossings, where traffic backed up and emigrants spent extra time preparing wagons and livestock for the ford, also saw repeated outbreaks. The death toll in 1850 may have exceeded that of 1849, but again the numbers are uncertain. The best historical work on the overland trails, drawing on extensive archival research, suggests that disease caused more illness and death than any other factor on the journey. Cholera, specifically, is identified as the most significant disease threat during the gold rush years. The documentary evidence, from diaries to letters to marked graves, consistently supports this conclusion. The myth that gunfights and Indian attacks were the primary dangers of the trail is exactly that, a myth. The real danger was the water. The peak year for combined trail traffic was 1852, when approximately 70,000 people traveled the Wyoming segment of the route. This figure includes the Oregon, California, and Mormon Trails, all of which shared the Platte and North Platte corridors. The concentration of people and livestock was extraordinary. At some campsites, the wagon trains were camped side by side as far as the eye could see. The grass was grazed down to bare dirt. The water sources were trampled and fouled, and the cholera bacteria thrived in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Reports from 1852 describe a drop in emigrant traffic compared to 1850 and 1851, followed by the surge to 70,000. The fluctuations in traffic volume affected the disease dynamics. In years with lower traffic, the contamination of water sources was less severe, and the incidence of cholera declined. In years with high traffic, the contamination was worse, and the death toll rose. This pattern is visible in the documentary record, though the exact figures are always estimates rather than hard counts. The emigrants' response to cholera evolved slowly. In 1849, many companies had no idea what they were facing. By 1850, the disease was widely known and feared, but effective responses remained elusive. Some trains tried to avoid contaminated water by camping away from the main route, but this was difficult because the wagons needed to follow established paths and the livestock needed grass and water. Other trains tried to move faster, hoping to outrun the epidemic, but speed brought its own problems. Exhausted animals, broken wagons, and internal conflicts. A few companies implemented rudimentary sanitation measures, burying waste away from water sources, but these efforts were unsystematic and not based on an understanding of the true transmission mechanism. The medical profession offered little help. Doctors traveling with the trains had no effective treatments. Their remedies were based on the same flawed theories that prevailed back east. Some physicians recognized that cholera was contagious and tried to isolate sick members of the company. But without understanding the role of contaminated water, isolation was only marginally effective. The disease continued to spread, and the doctors continued to bleed, purge, and dose with opiates, while their patients continued to die. The psychological impact of cholera on the emigrants was profound. The speed of death, the lack of warning, the visible horror of the symptoms, all combined to create an atmosphere of dread. Diaries from the cholera years describe a pervasive sense of helplessness. People prayed, they wrote letters home, they said goodbye to loved ones while still healthy, just in case. Some emigrants believed they were being tested by God. Others believed the disease was random, a matter of bad luck or bad air. A few began to suspect that the water was involved, but even these suspicions were vague and did not lead to systematic changes in behavior. The graves along the trail became landmarks. Emigrants counted them, noted their condition, and sometimes recorded the names if the markers were legible. The sheer number of graves was a constant reminder of mortality. One diarist wrote that the trail was paved with graves. Another described the prairie as a long cemetery. These descriptions are not hyperbole. The documentary evidence confirms that hundreds of graves lined the Platte River corridor by the early 1850s. Most were unmarked or poorly marked. The wooden markers rotted or blew away. The stones, if there were stones, sank into the soil or were scattered by animals or weather. Some families took great care with their dead, carving names and dates into durable markers, building cairns or fences around the graves to protect them from scavengers. But many had neither the time nor the resources for such measures. A grave dug at dawn might be abandoned by noon as the wagon train rolled west. There were no funerals in the traditional sense, no church services, no gathering of the community. The dead were buried where they fell, and the living moved on. The decision to mark or not mark a grave often reflected fear of desecration. Emigrants knew that wolves, coyotes, and other scavengers would dig up shallow graves. Some trains deliberately disguised graves, rolling wagon wheels over them to flatten the soil and erase the evidence. This practice was intended to protect the dead, but it also made it impossible to identify the graves later. The result is that the majority of trail graves are lost to history. We know they existed, we know roughly where they were, but we cannot name the individuals or mark the exact spots. George Winslow's grave is an exception. His name and date, June 8, 1849, were preserved because his companions took the time to carve them into a marker, and because that marker, or the information from it, survived into the modern era. Winslow's story is the story of hundreds or thousands of others whose names we do not know. He woke healthy, he sickened, he died within hours, and he was buried beside the trail. His death was not exceptional, it was typical. The westward journey was divided into stages, each with its own challenges and landmarks. The first stage, from the Missouri to Fort Kearny, covered about 200 miles and introduced the emigrants to the rhythms of trail life. The second stage, from Fort Kearny to Fort Laramie, was another 450 miles and included the worst of the cholera zone. The third stage, from Fort Laramie to South Pass and beyond, took the trains into the mountains and toward their final destinations. Each stage had its own hazards, weather, terrain, accidents, and disease. But cholera was overwhelmingly concentrated in the second stage, the long flat stretch along the Platte and North Platte. Fort Kearny was established in 1848 as a military post to support the overland trails. It sat near present-day Kearny, Nebraska, roughly 200 miles west of the Missouri River towns. By the time wagon trains reached Fort Kearny, they had been on the trail for about 2 weeks. The post provided a rest stop, a chance to send letters, and sometimes a source of medical aid, though the Army doctors had no better treatments for cholera than anyone else. Fort Kearny was also the point where the separate trails out of different jumping-off towns began to converge into a single corridor along the Platte. Between Fort Kearny and Fort Laramie, the trail followed the south bank of the Platte River, then angled northwest to the North Platte. This segment was the heart of the cholera zone. The Platte was a wide, shallow, muddy river, notorious for being a mile wide and an inch deep, as the emigrants liked to say. The water was silty and unpleasant to drink, but it was the only water available for long stretches. Wagon trains filled their barrels from the Platte, boiled their coffee with Platte water, and cooked their beans with Platte water. If the Platte was contaminated with cholera, everyone who drank from it was at risk. The North Platte, by contrast, was narrower and flowed faster, especially in its upper reaches. The water was clearer and tasted better. Contemporary accounts note that cholera was less common along the upper North Platte and west of Fort Laramie. The difference in hydrology probably explains the difference in disease incidence. Faster flowing water is less easily contaminated and dilutes pathogens more effectively. The upper North Platte and the mountain streams beyond Fort Laramie were less hospitable to Vibrio cholerae than the sluggish, heavily used waters of the lower Platte. Fort Laramie itself was a hub of activity during the emigrant season. The post had been a fur trading fort before the Army bought it in 1849 and converted it into a military installation. It sat in a strategic location near the Black Hills and the route to South Pass, and it served as a waypoint for emigrants, traders, and military patrols. By the time wagon trains reached Laramie, they had been on the trail for 4 to 6 weeks and had covered roughly 650 miles. Many companies rested there for a few days, made repairs, traded worn-out livestock for fresh animals, and sent letters home via the military mail. The letters, sent from Fort Laramie in 1850 and subsequent years, provide valuable historical evidence. A.C. Sponsler's letter from 1850 mentions that cholera killed hundreds on the plains that year and that the disease was rare west of the fort. Other letters echo this observation. The pattern is consistent. Heavy mortality before Laramie, declining incidence after. This geographic split likely saved lives. Emigrants who survived the Platte River corridor had a much better chance of completing the journey, even though many other hazards, from mountain passes to river crossings to winter storms, still awaited them. The decision points on the trail were numerous. Emigrants had to choose when to start, which route to take, how fast to travel, where to camp, and whether to stay with their original company or split off. These decisions were often made under stress and with incomplete information. Cholera added another layer of uncertainty. If a company had sick members, should the healthy members stay and care for them, or should they move on to protect themselves? If a campsite was rumored to be contaminated, should the train stop there anyway because the livestock needed water? These dilemmas had no good answers. Every choice carried risk. The wagon trains that left the Missouri early in the season, in April or early May, often fared better than those that left later. Early trains encountered less traffic, less competition for grass and water, and less contamination of campsites. But starting too early carried its own risks. If the grass was not yet tall enough, the livestock could starve. If the weather turned cold, the emigrants could freeze. Timing the departure was a gamble, and cholera made the stakes even higher. A company that left late might arrive in a cholera zone just as an outbreak was peaking. A company that left early might avoid the worst of the epidemic but face other challenges. The social dynamics within wagon trains shifted as the journey progressed. Companies that started out cohesive often fractured after a few weeks. Disputes over leadership, pace, or behavior could split a train into smaller groups. Cholera accelerated these fractures. Healthy families did not want to travel with sick ones. Strong wagons did not want to wait for weak ones. The egalitarian ideals that many companies espoused at the start of the journey gave way to a harsher calculus of self-preservation. The sick were sometimes abandoned. The weak were left behind. The trail demanded ruthlessness, and cholera made the demand explicit. The livestock, especially the draft animals, were essential to the journey. Without oxen or mules to pull the wagons, the emigrants were stranded. The animals, like the people, were vulnerable to disease and exhaustion. Cholera did not affect the animals, but the conditions that spread cholera, crowded campsites, and contaminated water were hard on livestock too. Overgrazing reduced the available forage. Alkali water sickened the animals. Heat, cold, and hard pulling took their toll. By the time a wagon train reached Fort Laramie, many of the draft animals were worn out and had to be replaced or rested. The economic aspects of the journey were significant. Outfitting a wagon for the trip cost several $100s, a substantial sum in 1849. The cost included the wagon itself, the draft animals, the supplies, and the equipment. Poor emigrants could not afford the journey. Those who went west were typically middle-class farmers or skilled workers with enough savings to cover the initial investment. But the trail could bankrupt even the well-prepared. Livestock died or was stolen. Wagons broke down, supplies ran out. Prices at the forts and trading posts were exorbitant. Emigrants who reached California or Oregon often arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Cholera did not discriminate by wealth or social status. Rich and poor, educated and illiterate, men and women, adults and children, all were equally vulnerable. The disease killed indiscriminately, which was part of what made it so terrifying. There was no way to predict who would fall sick and who would be spared. Families watched helplessly as their loved ones died. Parents buried children. Children buried parents. The social fabric of the wagon trains was torn apart by the random cruelty of the disease. The legacy of the cholera epidemic on the overland trails is twofold. First, it established disease as the primary hazard of westward migration during the gold rush years. The myth of the violent frontier, perpetuated by later fiction and film, obscures this reality. Gunfights and Indian attacks accounted for a tiny fraction of trail deaths. Disease, especially cholera, was the true killer. Second, the epidemic left a physical legacy in the graves that still dot the landscape. Most are unmarked and unidentified, but they are there, beneath the prairie soil, a reminder of the human cost of expansion. Historians have attempted to quantify the total death toll on the overland trails, but the numbers remain uncertain. Estimates range from a low of 10,000 to a high of 30,000 or more for the entire period from 1840 to 1860. The variation reflects the incomplete and inconsistent nature of the documentary record. What is not in dispute is that disease caused the majority of deaths, and that cholera was the leading disease during the peak years of emigration. The National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and academic historians all agree on this point. The evidence from diaries, letters, grave markers, and contemporary reports is overwhelming. The emigrants themselves recognized that disease was the greatest danger, even if they did not fully understand how it spread. By the early 1850s, guidebooks and emigrant manuals were warning travelers about cholera and advising them to avoid contaminated water, though the advice was vague and often ineffective. Some emigrants tried to filter or settle the water before drinking. Others avoided camping at sites where graves were visible, assuming correctly that those locations were associated with disease. These precautions were too little and too late to prevent the epidemic, but they show that the emigrants were learning from experience, however slowly. The decline of cholera on the overland trails after the mid-1850s was due to several factors. Emigrant traffic decreased as the California gold rush waned, and as alternative routes, including steamship and railroad, became available. The reduced traffic meant less contamination of water sources and fewer opportunities for the disease to spread. At the same time, public health knowledge was slowly improving. The connection between contaminated water and cholera was becoming clearer, though germ theory was still years away from general acceptance. By the 1860s, cholera was less of a threat on the trails, though it never disappeared entirely. The overland trails themselves were gradually replaced by faster, safer forms of transportation. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, made the wagon journey obsolete for most travelers. The era of mass migration by wagon train ended, and with it the conditions that had made the cholera epidemic possible. The trails fell into disuse, the ruts were plowed under, and the graves were forgotten. The story of cholera on the Oregon Trail became a footnote in the larger narrative of westward expansion, overshadowed by the more dramatic and photogenic myths of the frontier. But the facts remain. Water killed more people than bullets in the Wild West. The arithmetic is stark and undeniable. Between 1849 and 1855, thousands of emigrants died on the overland trails. The majority died of disease. The majority of those disease deaths were caused by cholera. The disease was transmitted through fecal contamination of water and food. The emigrants did not understand this mechanism and had no effective way to prevent or treat the disease. They drank from contaminated streams, camped at contaminated springs, and buried their dead beside the water that had killed them. And then they moved on, carrying the epidemic with them, grave by grave, mile by mile, across 2,000 miles of prairie and mountain. The cholera outbreaks on the overland trails represent one of the largest and deadliest epidemics in American history. The death toll, while uncertain, was measured in hundreds at minimum and possibly thousands. The social and psychological impact on the emigrants was profound. The disease shattered families, destroyed wagon trains, and left a trail of graves from Missouri to Oregon. And yet the epidemic has been largely forgotten, eclipsed by the mythology of the violent frontier. This episode has attempted to correct that omission, to bring the documentary evidence into focus, and to tell the story that the primary sources demand we tell. The graves are still there. Most are unmarked and unidentified. Some have been located by archaeologists and historians using metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and comparisons with emigrant diaries. A few, like George Winslow's grave, are marked and memorialized, but the vast majority remain anonymous, lost beneath the soil of Nebraska, Wyoming, and Idaho. They are the physical legacy of the epidemic, the proof that water, not bullets, was the great killer of the westward migration. June 8, 1849. George Winslow dies beside the trail near Fairbury, Nebraska. His companions bury him and carve his name into a wooden marker. By evening, the wagon train is gone. By the next morning, another train has passed. By the end of the summer, dozens more will pass. Some will stop to read the marker. Some will add their own graves to the line. Some will make it all the way to California or Oregon. But none of them will forget the speed with which a man can die when the water is bad. None of them will forget that the frontier's greatest danger was invisible, bacterial, and carried in every canteen. None of them will forget that the myth of the Wild West, violent and lawless, was built on a foundation of graves dug not by gunslingers, but by disease. The marker stands, or stood, as a testament to one man's death and to the deaths of hundreds or thousands like him. The wood has rotted, the inscription has faded, but the fact remains, documented in the National Park Service records, preserved in the historical memory. George Winslow died of cholera on June 8, 1849, and his grave is one of the few we can still name. The analysis must begin with the mechanism. Cholera spread because the emigrants did not understand how disease was transmitted. They had no concept of bacteria, no knowledge of the fecal-oral route, no framework for understanding that their own waste was poisoning the water they drank downstream. This ignorance was universal. Doctors, educated men, ministers, and frontier guides all shared the same flawed theories. Miasma theory, the belief that disease arose from bad air or rotting organic matter, was the dominant explanation. It led to useless precautions, like avoiding swamps or moving camp away from the smell of death. But it did nothing to address the actual problem: contaminated water. The structure of the wagon train migration made the epidemic worse. The trains followed the same routes, camped at the same springs, and crossed the same rivers. Traffic was concentrated in a narrow corridor because the wagons needed grass, water, and relatively flat terrain. This concentration turned every popular campsite into a potential disease reservoir. A single infected individual could contaminate a spring or a stream segment, and every wagon that stopped there afterward would be exposed. The problem compounded over time. As more trains passed through, the contamination grew worse. By midsummer, some water sources along the Platte were so heavily polluted that they were effectively biological hazards, though no one at the time understood this. The speed of cholera mortality intensified the panic. Diseases that killed slowly, like tuberculosis or cancer, allowed time for adjustment, for farewells, for the rituals of death. Cholera allowed none of that. Victims went from health to death in a matter of hours. The suddenness violated the emigrants' expectations of how dying was supposed to work. It felt like a supernatural punishment, a divine wrath, rather than a natural process. This perception made it harder for people to respond rationally. Instead of changing their behavior, they prayed, they blamed themselves or others, they tried to appease an angry God. None of it worked. The lack of effective medical treatment meant that survival was largely a matter of chance. Some people exposed to cholera never became sick. Some developed mild cases and recovered. Some died within hours. The variability in outcomes was probably due to differences in the dose of bacteria ingested, individual immune responses, and the overall health of the victim before infection. But the emigrants had no way to know this. From their perspective, survival was random and inexplicable. This randomness deepened the sense of helplessness and fear. The economic incentives of the migration worked against public health. The emigrants were in a race against time. They needed to reach California or Oregon before the mountain snows closed the passes, typically by late October or early November. Starting too late or traveling too slowly meant being trapped in the mountains over winter, which could be fatal, as the Donner Party had demonstrated in 1846. The pressure to keep moving was immense. Stopping to care for the sick, to bury the dead properly, or to rest at a safe distance from contaminated water sources was costly in terms of time. Many companies chose to keep moving, even when it meant abandoning the sick or taking risks with contaminated water. The alternative, arriving late and facing winter in the mountains, seemed worse. The role of the Missouri River jumping-off towns in seeding the epidemic cannot be overstated. Cholera was endemic in the river valleys by the late 1840s. The towns were crowded, unsanitary, and full of people preparing for the trail. Contaminated water and food were common. Emigrants who arrived healthy could contract cholera before they even started west. Those who carried the disease with them introduced it to the trail. The first cases on any given wagon train often appeared within the first few days or weeks of travel, while the trains were still relatively close to the Missouri. This timing suggests that the disease was contracted in the jumping-off towns or during the early stages of the journey, then spread within the train and between trains as they moved west. The infrastructure of the trail, such as it was, did little to prevent disease. There were no sanitation facilities, no clean water supplies, no medical posts beyond the occasional fort with an army surgeon. The emigrants were on their own. They had to provide their own food, their own shelter, their own defense, and their own medical care. The forts, like Fort Kearny and Fort Laramie, offered limited assistance. They could provide some supplies, some information, and sometimes a place to rest. But they could not treat cholera effectively, and they could not prevent its spread. The cultural context of the time also played a role. Mid-19th century Americans were deeply religious, and many interpreted cholera as a moral judgment. The disease was seen as a punishment for sin, either individual or collective. This belief led to responses that ranged from prayer and repentance to fatalism and despair. It did not lead to effective public health measures because the underlying assumption was that the disease was spiritual rather than material. Some emigrants believed that the godly would be spared and the wicked would be struck down. The reality that cholera killed indiscriminately challenged this belief but did not entirely displace it. The documentary evidence from the trail, the diaries and letters, reveals the psychological toll of the epidemic. Emigrants wrote about their fear, their grief, their anger, and their confusion. They described watching friends and family members die. They described the guilt of leaving the sick behind. They described the numbing effect of seeing grave after grave, day after day, until death became routine. The emotional weight of the cholera years is palpable in these documents. The emigrants were traumatized by what they experienced, and the trauma shaped their understanding of the West and their place in it. The myth of the violent frontier served a purpose. It allowed Americans to romanticize the westward expansion, to turn it into a story of heroism and adventure. The reality that most emigrants died of disease rather than violence was less heroic and less exciting. It was also more difficult to process. Disease deaths were mundane, unglamorous, and uncomfortably random. They did not fit the narrative of manifest destiny or the conquest of the wilderness. And so the myth took precedence. Dime novels, Wild West shows, and later Hollywood films focused on gunfights, Indian attacks, and outlaw gangs. The cholera epidemic was forgotten or relegated to a footnote. But the evidence does not allow us to sustain the myth. The diaries, the grave markers, the letters, the government reports all point to the same conclusion. Disease was the primary cause of death on the overland trails, and cholera was the primary disease during the gold rush years. The numbers, though uncertain, are consistent with this conclusion. The geographic pattern, heavy mortality between the Missouri and Fort Laramie, declining incidence to the west, matches what we would expect from a waterborne epidemic. The timeline, peaking in 1849 and 1850 and declining thereafter, corresponds to the surge and decline in emigrant traffic. Every piece of evidence supports the thesis that water killed more people than bullets in the Wild West. The limitations of the evidence must also be acknowledged. We do not have a complete list of the dead. We do not know the exact number of cholera deaths for any given year. We do not have detailed medical records or autopsies. What we have are fragmentary accounts, estimates, and indirect indicators. Historians have done their best to reconstruct the epidemic using the available sources, but uncertainty remains. The death toll could have been a few hundred or several thousand. The true figure will probably never be known with precision, but the central fact that cholera was the leading cause of death on the trail during the peak years is not in doubt. The comparison with other causes of death is instructive. Indian attacks, often portrayed as the primary danger of the trail, accounted for a tiny fraction of the mortality. The best estimates suggest that fewer than 400 emigrants were killed by Indians over the entire period from 1840 to 1860. Accidental shootings, drownings, wagon accidents, and other mishaps accounted for more deaths than Indian attacks, but still far fewer than disease. Cholera alone probably killed more emigrants in the years 1849 and 1850 than all other causes combined during those years. The arithmetic is stark. Disease dwarfed violence as a cause of death on the overland trails. The response of the United States government to the cholera epidemic was minimal. There was no public health infrastructure on the frontier, no systematic effort to provide clean water or sanitation facilities, no coordinated medical response. The army forts offered what help they could, but their resources were limited, and their understanding of the disease was no better than anyone else's. The government's primary concern was facilitating westward expansion, not protecting the health of the emigrants. The trails were built and maintained by the emigrants themselves, not by the government. The graves were dug by private citizens, not by public officials. The epidemic was a private tragedy, not a public health crisis, at least in the eyes of the authorities. The long-term consequences of the cholera epidemic shaped the demography and history of the American West. The families that survived the journey, that made it to California or Oregon without losing members to disease, were the ones who populated the new territories and states. The families that were shattered by cholera, that lost parents or children or entire households, either turned back or arrived diminished. The selective pressure of the epidemic, though brutal and random, had a lasting impact on who settled the West and what kind of communities they built. The memory of the cholera years faded quickly. By the 1870s, the war, overland trails were no longer in use, and the emigrants who had survived the epidemic were aging. Their children and grandchildren heard stories of the journey, but the focus was usually on the adventure, the hardship, the triumph of arrival. The disease and the graves were less often discussed. The cultural amnesia was reinforced by the mythology of the frontier, which emphasized violence and conquest rather than suffering and disease. The cholera epidemic became an obscure chapter in the history of westward expansion, known to specialists but forgotten by the general public. Modern historians have worked to recover this history. The National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and academic researchers have studied the trails, located graves, and analyzed the documentary record. Their work has established the basic facts of the epidemic and corrected the distortions of the popular mythology. The result is a more accurate and more sobering picture of the westward migration. The journey was not primarily a story of heroic conflict with outlaws and Indians. It was primarily a story of ordinary people facing extraordinary hardship, with disease as the greatest hazard and death as a constant companion. The environmental context of the epidemic also deserves attention. The Platte River Valley, the main corridor of the trail, was a fragile ecosystem that could not sustain the level of traffic that passed through during the gold rush years. The grass was overgrazed, the water sources were polluted, the wildlife was driven away or hunted out. The damage was temporary. The ecosystem recovered after the trails fell into disuse. But during the peak years, the environmental degradation contributed to the spread of disease and the hardship of the journey. The emigrants were not just passing through the landscape, they were altering it, and the alterations had consequences for their own survival. The role of technology, or the lack of it, was critical. The emigrants had no way to test water for contamination, no way to purify it beyond boiling, which they rarely did, and no way to treat cholera effectively once it appeared. The technology that might have saved lives, microscopy to identify bacteria, chemical disinfection, oral rehydration therapy, did not yet exist or was not yet understood. The emigrants were trapped in a moment of technological and medical transition. They had enough knowledge to recognize that cholera was dangerous and possibly contagious, but not enough to prevent or treat it. They lived in the worst possible moment for a waterborne epidemic. The social organization of the wagon trains, based on voluntary cooperation and elected leadership, was poorly suited to managing a public health crisis. The trains had no central authority with the power to enforce sanitation measures or quarantine sick members. Decisions were made by consensus or by majority vote, and consensus was difficult to achieve when the stakes were life and death. Some trains tried to implement rules about waste disposal or water use, but enforcement was weak and compliance was uneven. The result was that collective action problems, the tragedy of the commons, played out in miniature on every wagon train. Individual families acted in their own short-term interest, even when collective action would have benefited everyone. The demographic profile of the emigrants also influenced the epidemic's impact. The wagon trains included men, women, and children, though men outnumbered women, especially on the California Trail, where many travelers were single men heading to the gold fields. Cholera affected all age groups, but the very young and the very old were at higher risk, as were people who were already weakened by other illnesses or by the hardships of the journey. Pregnant women faced additional risks. The loss of a parent, especially a mother, could be catastrophic for a family on the trail. Children orphaned by cholera sometimes had to be adopted by other families in the train or sent back east if the train encountered someone heading in that direction. The financial cost of the epidemic was also significant. Emigrants who died on the trail represented not only a human loss, but also an economic loss. They had invested their savings in the journey, and their death meant that investment was wasted. Families that lost breadwinners faced destitution. Widows and orphans who reached California or Oregon often arrived with nothing and had to rely on charity or remarriage to survive. The cholera epidemic, in addition to its human toll, imposed a substantial economic burden on the survivors and on the communities that received them. The spatial pattern of the epidemic, concentrated in the Platte River corridor and declining west of Fort Laramie, has been explained by differences in hydrology, but other factors may also have played a role. By the time wagon trains reached Fort Laramie, the companies that were most vulnerable to cholera had already been thinned out. The survivors were either resistant to the disease, lucky, or better informed about how to avoid contaminated water. The declining incidence west of Laramie may reflect not only cleaner water, but also a healthier and more cautious population. The epidemic, in effect, selected for survivors, and those survivors faced lower risk as they continued west. The comparison with other cholera epidemics of the same period is also instructive. Cholera struck cities and towns throughout the United States and Europe during the mid-19th century. Urban epidemics often killed thousands in a matter of weeks. The London cholera outbreak of 1854, famously investigated by John Snow, killed over 600 people in a single neighborhood. The trail epidemic, spread out over hundreds of miles and several years, was less concentrated but no less deadly in aggregate. The difference was that urban epidemics were visible and drew public attention and eventually public health responses, while the trail epidemic was dispersed, uncoordinated, and largely invisible to the authorities. The emigrants died in isolation, far from cities and newspapers, and their deaths were not counted or mourned in the same way. The scientific understanding of cholera advanced rapidly in the decades after the trail epidemic. John Snow's work in London in 1854 established the connection between contaminated water and cholera, though his findings were not immediately accepted. By the 1880s, Robert Koch had identified the cholera bacterium, and the germ theory of disease was becoming widely accepted. By the early 20th century, cholera was a preventable and treatable disease in countries with modern sanitation and medical infrastructure. But for the emigrants of 1849 and 1850, these advances came too late. They lived and died in the last years of the pre-scientific understanding of infectious disease. The ethical questions raised by the epidemic are difficult. Was it morally acceptable for healthy members of a wagon train to abandon sick members in order to save themselves? Was it justifiable to prioritize speed over compassion, to leave graves unmarked in order to keep moving? These questions have no easy answers. The emigrants faced an impossible situation. They were in a race against time, traveling through a harsh environment with no effective medical care and no guarantee of survival. They made choices that seem callous by modern standards, but those choices were often the only options available. Judging them harshly ignores the context and the constraints they faced. The legacy of the cholera epidemic is visible today in the scattered graves and historical markers along the old trail routes. The National Park Service and other organizations have worked to identify and preserve these sites. Some graves have been fenced or marked with modern memorials. Others remain unmarked and unidentified, known only from references in emigrant diaries or from archaeological surveys. The graves are a physical reminder of the human cost of westward expansion and a corrective to the mythology that has obscured that cost. The broader lesson of the epidemic is that infrastructure matters. Clean water, sanitation, medical care, and public health systems are not luxuries, they are necessities. The emigrants on the overland trails lack these things, and thousands of them died as a result. Modern societies have largely solved the problems that killed the emigrants, at least in the developed world. Cholera is now rare in countries with clean water and sewage treatment. But the disease remains a threat in places where infrastructure is lacking, and the lessons of the trail epidemic remain relevant. Water can still kill, and access to clean water is still a matter of life and death for millions of people around the world. The story of cholera on the Oregon Trail is a story about the limits of human knowledge and the consequences of ignorance. The emigrants did not know that they were drinking contaminated water. They did not know that their own waste was poisoning the streams. They did not know that the disease that killed them could be prevented by simple sanitation measures. They were brave, determined, and resourceful, but they were also ignorant, and their ignorance killed them. The epidemic is a reminder that knowledge is power and that the absence of knowledge can be fatal. The consequences of the cholera epidemic extended beyond the immediate death toll. The survivors carried the trauma of the experience with them for the rest of their lives. They told stories of the graves, the deaths, the fear. They passed those stories to their children, though often in sanitized or mythologized form. The collective memory of the trail emphasized the hardships overcome, the dangers faced, the triumph of arrival. But beneath the triumphalist narrative was a darker reality. The random cruelty of disease, the helplessness of the living, the unmarked graves of the dead. That reality has been obscured by myth, but it is recoverable through careful attention to the primary sources and the documentary record. The recovery and conservation efforts along the old trail routes have been modest but significant. Historians and archaeologists have worked to locate graves, map routes, and preserve artifacts. The National Park Service administers several sites associated with the overland trails, including sections of the original ruts and a few preserved grave sites. These efforts are important for historical education and for correcting the popular misconceptions about the trail experience. The graves are not glamorous, and they do not tell a heroic story, but they tell a true story, and that truth deserves to be remembered. The policy implications of the cholera epidemic, had anyone at the time been paying attention, were clear. Public health requires infrastructure, clean water, sanitation, medical care, and education. The emigrants lacked all of these things, and they paid the price. The United States government could have done more to support the emigrants, to provide clean water sources, to establish medical stations, to educate travelers about the risks of contaminated water. But the government did not do these things, and the epidemic was left to run its course. The failure was not one of malice, but of neglect and ignorance. The authorities, like the emigrants, did not understand the disease and did not know how to prevent it. The final reckoning of the cholera epidemic on the overland trails must include an acknowledgement of what we do not know and cannot know. The exact death toll will never be determined. The names of most of the victims are lost. The locations of most of the graves are unknown. The documentary record is incomplete, and the physical evidence is fragmentary. But the broad outlines of the story are clear and well supported by the evidence. Cholera was the leading cause of death on the trails during the gold rush years. The disease spread through contaminated water. The emigrants did not understand this and had no effective response. Hundreds, possibly thousands, died. The graves were mostly unmarked. The epidemic was concentrated between the Missouri and Fort Laramie. It declined after the mid-1850s as traffic decreased and as some knowledge of prevention slowly accumulated. These facts are established beyond reasonable doubt, even if many details remain uncertain. The commemoration of the cholera epidemic has been uneven. A few grave sites are marked and memorialized. A few victims, like George Winslow, are remembered by name, but most of the dead remain anonymous, their graves unmarked, their stories forgotten. This anonymity is itself a historical fact worth noting. The emigrants who died of cholera did not die in famous battles or dramatic confrontations. They died of a disease unglamorously in the middle of nowhere, and they were buried and forgotten. Their deaths were not recorded in newspapers or celebrated in literature. They simply disappeared into the prairie soil, and history moved on without them. Recovering their story requires a deliberate effort to look past the mythology and to attend to the documentary evidence that survives. The interpretive challenge for historians is to tell the story of the cholera epidemic in a way that respects the evidence, honors the dead, and corrects the mythological distortions without being preachy or presentist. The emigrants were not stupid or reckless. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges with the knowledge and resources available to them. They did the best they could, and many of them died anyway. Their story is tragic, not because they failed, but because they succeeded in reaching the West despite the odds, and because the cost of that success, measured in graves and grief, was so high. The story deserves to be told plainly and honestly, without romanticization and without condemnation. June 8, 1849. George Winslow's marker goes into the ground near present-day Fairbury, Nebraska. The inscription is simple. His name, the date. It does not say how he died, but everyone on the trail that summer knew. Cholera, the water, the invisible killer that struck without warning and left graves in its wake from Missouri to the mountains. The marker was meant to last, a small gesture of remembrance in a landscape that offered none. It stood for years, decades perhaps, before the wood rotted and the letters faded. But the fact was recorded, preserved in someone's diary or letter, and eventually in the archives where historians would find it more than a century later. The story of George Winslow is the story of the cholera epidemic in miniature. One man, one date, one grave. Multiply it by hundreds or thousands, stretch it across 2,000 miles and 6 years, and you have the full scope of the disaster. Water, not bullets, killed George Winslow. Water, not violence, killed the hundreds or thousands like him. The arithmetic is simple and brutal. The documentary evidence is consistent. The conclusion is inescapable. The Wild West, the frontier of myth and legend, was a place where the greatest danger came not from outlaws or Indians, but from the water itself, contaminated by human waste and ignorance, flowing silently through the prairie, carrying death downstream to every wagon train that stopped to drink.